I should have brought a stool. Any of our colleagues have a stool over there? I have a ladder to trade with them.
Probably has to introduce them. Something about 15 more people.
Right here, right off this ladder.
Try and move to my left. Everybody looks like it's open press now. Must be a big deal. Doesn't look perfect.
No, oh, you open me? You open my hand? Oh, okay. I was trying to get. I was just trying to give John some. Brian some brother.
I don't want to kill my battery here.
This is an NBC News special report. Here's Lester Holt.
Good morning, everyone. We're coming on the air to bring you the first public remarks from President Trump following last night's missile attack by Iran on U.S.-occupied bases in Iraq. The latest salvo in what is surely the most perilous moment in U.S.-Iran relations in more than 40 years. This current crisis began just 12 days ago with an escalating exchange of hostilities between the two countries, leading to an attack on the U.S. Embassy in Baghdad by Iranian-backed protesters. Then 5 days ago, a U.S. airstrike in Baghdad ordered by President Trump that killed Iran's top General Qassem Soleimani. Iran vowed revenge, and last night it came through. There are indications Iran may, however, have pulled its punches to avoid further escalation. The question now, of course, how will President Trump respond? He will be speaking at the White House just moments from now. Things are set there. We have indications that they've been making perhaps some last-minute adjustments to his remarks, but we expect the president to emerge shortly. In the meantime, NBC's Kristen Welker is at the White House. Kristen, what can you tell us?
Lester, good morning. I'm here in the Grand Foyer where we are waiting for President Trump to address the nation for the first time since those attacks overnight. The big question, will President Trump announce a retaliation against Iran? Or will he announce a de-escalation? If you look to the tweet that he sent out last night, it was not fire and brimstone. Instead, it seemed to point to the fact that there have been no fatalities reported. He said, so far, so good. So we anticipate what he will say. We know that Democrats and Republicans are calling on the administration to de-escalate. So President Trump has had a busy morning. He spent part of it in the Situation Room with the vice president, a number of other top officials. We are told that he will be joined by the vice president when he comes to the podium in just a few moments from now, Lester. And they have been monitoring the developments overnight, reaching out to Democrats, reaching out to Republicans, trying to make sure that they are briefed on the situation and the developments abroad. I anticipate we would hear President Trump defend his decision to take out Iran's top general. The administration has made the case that he posed an imminent threat to the U.S. Democrats have said they want to see the evidence. We know that top officials will be briefing the full Congress later today. So, Lester, we are here waiting for President Trump. Behind me, seated a number of national security officials. Lester?
All right, and we see some of the principals now taking their position at the podium, the leadership. As we wait for the president to emerge quickly, let's go to Courtney Kube at the Pentagon. What have you learned there this morning?
Well, we're all waiting to hear exactly what we just heard from Kristen Welker, and that is, what will President Trump, what kind of tone will he take here this morning? We had this killing of Qassem Soleimani only days ago. The U.S. military in the ensuing days posturing for a defensive, any kind of an attack from Iran, preparing for that attack to come onto a U.S. military installation in Iraq just in the last hours. We know now that the casualty count is 0. There were no Americans killed in these strikes. How will that impact President Trump's decision to respond? Will this be any kind of a military response? Or the fact that the casualty count is 0, does that mean that, in fact, it'll be a larger diplomatic response? Lester?
All right. Thank you, Courtney Kube. Let's go quickly to Iraq right now, where Richard Engel is in Erbil, near one of the places that was attacked. Richard, what have you learned there this morning?
Well, right now we are in a wait-and-see mode. Iran says it will not carry out more attacks unless there is a counterattack from the United States.
Richard, we're going to have to move back to the White House. The president now at the podium.
As long as I'm president of the United States, Iran will never be allowed to have a nuclear weapon. Good morning. I'm pleased to inform you the American people should be extremely grateful and happy. No Americans were harmed in last night's attack by the Iranian regime. We suffered no casualties. All of our soldiers are safe, and only minimal damage was sustained at our military bases. Our great American forces are prepared for anything. Iran appears to be standing down, which is a good thing for all parties concerned and a very good thing for the world. No American or Iraqi lives were lost, because of the precautions taken, the dispersal of forces, and an early warning system that worked very well. I salute the incredible skill and courage of America's men and women in uniform. For far too long, all the way back to 1979 to be exact, nations have tolerated Iran's destructive and destabilizing behavior in the Middle East and beyond. Those days are over. Iran has been the leading sponsor of terrorism, and their pursuit of nuclear weapons threatens the civilized world. We will never let that happen. Last week, we took decisive action to stop a ruthless terrorist from threatening American lives. At my direction, the United States military eliminated the world's top terrorist, Qassem Soleimani. As the head of the Quds Force, Soleimani was personally responsible for some of the absolutely worst atrocities. He trained terrorist armies, including Hezbollah, launching terrorist strikes against civilian targets. He fueled bloody civil wars all across the region. He viciously wounded and murdered thousands of U.S. troops, including the planting of roadside bombs that maim and dismember their victims. Soleimani directed the recent attacks on U.S. personnel in Iraq that badly wounded 4 service members and killed 1 American, and he orchestrated the violent assault on the U.S. Embassy in Baghdad. In recent days, he was planning new attacks on American targets, but we stopped him. Soleimani's hands were drenched in both American and Iranian blood. He should have been terminated long ago. By removing Soleimani, we have sent a powerful message to terrorists. If you value your own life, you will not threaten the lives of our people. As we continue to evaluate options in response to Iranian aggression, the United States will immediately impose additional punishing economic sanctions on the Iranian regime. These powerful sanctions will remain until Iran changes its behavior. In recent months alone, Iran has seized ships in international waters, fired an unprovoked strike on Saudi Arabia, and shot down 2 U.S. drones. Iran's hostilities substantially increased after the foolish Iran nuclear deal was signed in 2013, and they were given $150 billion, not to mention $1.8 billion in cash. Instead of saying thank you to the United States, they chanted death to America. In fact, they chanted death to America the day the agreement was signed. Then Iran went on a terror spree, funded by the money from the deal, and created hell in Yemen, Syria, Lebanon, Afghanistan, and Iraq. The missiles fired last night at us and our allies were paid for with the funds made available by the last administration. The regime also greatly tightened the reins on their own country, even recently killing 1,500 people at the many protests that are taking place all throughout Iran. The very defective JCPOA expires shortly anyway and gives Iran a clear and quick path to nuclear breakout. Iran must abandon its nuclear ambitions and end its support for terrorism. The time has come for the United Kingdom, Germany, France, Russia, and China to recognize this reality. They must now break away from the remnants of the Iran deal, or JCPOA. And we must all work together toward making a deal with Iran that makes the world a safer and more peaceful place. We must also make a deal that allows Iran to thrive and prosper and take advantage of its enormous untapped potential. Iran can be a great country. Peace and stability cannot prevail in the Middle East as long as Iran continues to foment violence, unrest, hatred, and war. The civilized world must send a clear and unified message to the Iranian regime. Your campaign of terror, murder, mayhem will not be tolerated any longer. It will not be allowed to go forward. Today, I am going to ask NATO to become much more involved in the Middle East process. Over the last 3 years, under my leadership, our economy is stronger than ever before, and America has achieved energy independence. These historic accomplishments change our strategic priorities. These are accomplishments that nobody thought were possible. And options in the Middle East became available. We are now the #1 producer of oil and natural gas anywhere in the world. We are independent, and we do not need Middle East oil. The American military has been completely rebuilt under my administration at a cost of $2.5 trillion. U.S. armed forces are stronger than ever before. Our missiles are big, powerful, accurate, lethal, and fast. Under construction are many hypersonic missiles. The fact that we have this great military and equipment, however, does not mean we have to use it. We do not want to use it. American strength, both military and economic, is the best deterrent. 3 months ago, after destroying 100% of ISIS and its territorial caliphate, we killed the savage leader of ISIS, al-Baghdadi, who was responsible for so much death, including the mass beheadings of Christians, Muslims, and all who stood in his way. He was a monster. Al-Baghdadi was trying again to rebuild the ISIS caliphate and failed. Tens of thousands of ISIS fighters have been killed or captured during my administration. ISIS is a natural enemy of Iran. The destruction of ISIS is good for Iran, and we should work together on this and other shared priorities. Finally, to the people and leaders of Iran, we want you to have a future, and a great future, one that you deserve, one of prosperity at home and harmony with the nations of the world. The United States is ready to embrace peace with all who seek it. I want to thank you, and God bless America. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you.
You can hear reporters in the room asking questions, the president taking none as he concludes his remarks, his first reaction to the Iranian attack on U.S.-occupied bases in Iraq. The president, frankly, didn't have a lot to say about the attack itself. In terms of a response, he said they will impose new sanctions. The U.S. has already imposed some of the harshest sanctions on Iran and apparently prepared to do more, but there was no talk of any military response in the way we heard the president over the last several days. I want to go right now to Andrea Mitchell, who's been watching along with me, our chief foreign affairs correspondent. Andrea, what did you note in the president's remarks?
Well, it was a fascinating combination of the president's long-standing objections to the Obama nuclear deal, the Iran deal that he got out of in May of 2018, and blaming the previous administration for financing the missiles, he said, that were fired by Iran last night. No retaliation, no military retaliation from the U.S., but sounding tough. And, of course, what he said about Soleimani, saying that his hands were drenched with blood. But for all the tough talk and the threat of new economic sanctions, and it's hard to imagine what has not been sanctioned, because they've already sanctioned the central bank, the Federal Reserve, basically, of Iran, so that no one can move money on the international exchanges through Iran. Iran has been crippled economically by these sanctions as they've stepped them up. But the other thing is, by saying that, again, as he has said for years, that in the Iran nuclear deal that he provided, that the Obama administration provided $150 billion, that's just not factually correct. That was unfreezing the frozen Iranian assets that had been frozen since 1979 when they took the hostages, the 52 hostages, and took over our U.S. embassy. So the Iran nuclear deal did allow Iran to get back its own assets, and that is a lot of the money that he is describing.
All right, Andrew, let me go to Kristen Welker right now, who's in the room there at the White House, or was at the White House and watching along with us. I noted that the president, once again, defending his decision to go after Soleimani. I didn't necessarily hear the word imminent threat when he talked about the threat. I know there's been some mixed messaging on that issue.
That's a really important point, Lester, and you're absolutely right. President Trump gave a very robust defense of his decision to take out Iran's top general, Qassem Soleimani. At the same time, he really stressed Soleimani's background, the fact that his hands are drenched with blood, the blood of Americans, the blood of his fellow Iranians, and yet he didn't talk about what exactly that imminent threat was. What did it look like? Just a day earlier, his defense secretary said that there was, in fact, an imminent threat. He was tracking it within just days, but we didn't hear that kind of language from President Trump. So the question becomes, as we look forward to the rest of this day, what, if any, evidence will senior administration officials will they provide to the full Congress when they brief them later on today? We know that the Secretary of State, the Secretary of Defense will be among the briefers. You have Democrats and some Republicans saying that essentially the administration should declassify the intelligence that is behind the president's decision to go after Soleimani in the first place. So far, the administration has said they haven't made a decision about that. But Lester, you can bet they are going to get pressured on that. I would make one more point. You heard President Trump say that Iran seems to be standing down. The question becomes, is the president standing down militarily? He put the focus on sanctions. I tried to ask him as he was leaving if he had ruled out any type of military retaliation. He didn't answer any of our questions, but you can bet that those will be among the questions that lawmakers will have later on today. Lester.
Kristen, thanks. Yeah, the president coming out in his first remarks, the Americans should be grateful and happy that no American casualties, and there was minimal damage in those attacks, and certainly we are all grateful there was no loss of life. Let me bring in NBC News analyst and former U.S. Deputy Assistant Secretary for Iraq and Iran, Brett McGurk. Brett, thanks for joining us. You had talked last night about everyone kind of taking a step back. Does it occur that step back has occurred, that we are at a point now where, clear thinking is prevailing?
Well, I would really inject a note of caution. I think just following on what Kristen emphasized, that the president said Iran is taking a step back or standing down. I think knowing Iran, that's probably unlikely. I don't think we'll see an overt attack like we saw last night, this extraordinary event with ballistic missiles targeting Americans in Iraq. But Iran attacks through proxies. And since May of last year, we've been on an action-reaction cycle. Attacks in the Gulf against shipping, attacks against Saudi Arabia, and 20,000 American military personnel have poured into the Middle East. That seems to still be the track we're on. I think we're not on the top of that escalatory ladder as we seemed to be yesterday. That's good. But I did not see a new pathway to get out of this action-reaction cycle that we've been on really over the last 10 months.
And the president, we should note, called on NATO to become more involved in the Middle East. How do you think that's going to fly with NATO allies who have frankly been quite criticized by the president in the past?
Lester, I've worked with NATO. It's a great organization, but to do anything in NATO, you need unanimity among the 29 allies. So I think it's highly unlikely you're going to see NATO allies pouring into the Middle East to help us here. We embarked on this Iran policy called maximum pressure really unilaterally on our own, and we're having a hard time to find allies to come with us when we find ourselves in some trouble. So I think that's some wishful thinking. Again, since May, 20,000 more military personnel into the Middle East. I don't see them coming home anytime soon because I really did not see the way for the president to try to really open a new path for diplomacy. Diplomacy, Mark Twain said about diplomacy, it's give and take. Give one, take 10. But you have to give one sometimes. And to get back to the table, I think we're going to have to put a really concrete offer on the table to the Iranians. Here's what we expect. Here's the pathway. And right now, that really doesn't appear to be taking shape. All right, Brett McGurk, good to have you on. Thank you. We want to go to the Pentagon now. Courtney Kuby, who mans our post there. Courtney, what is the American military posture at this point in time?
It's been defensive ever since the killing of Qassem Soleimani only a few days ago, just last week. Right now, one of the things that stood out to me, though, from President Trump just now was him saying that he's going to call on NATO to become much more involved in the Middle East. You know, NATO actually had become much more involved, specifically in Iraq. Just in October of 2018, they created a training mission there, taken over by NATO and actually manned by a Canadian general as the first head of that. That mission, though, after the death of Qassem Soleimani, that mission was suspended because the counter-ISIS and the training mission had to stop while the U.S. military and the coalition had to focus more on force protection of the troops who were there against this threat from Iran and Iranian militias and proxies. So it's interesting that he's saying he wants NATO to do more. We have no idea in what capacity that would be, and I think whatever response NATO would have to that would also be fascinating. Another thing that really stood out to me, though, Lester, was him calling Qassem Soleimani the world's top terrorist. We know that, of course, he is on a foreign terror organization. Qassem Soleimani was, that is. But many people, intelligence and defense officials and analysts who I speak with, consider the head of al-Qaeda to be the world's top terrorist. Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, who was killed only weeks ago in Syria, he would be another one, but I've never actually heard Qassem Soleimani referred to in that way. That was also fascinating to me. And then just to reinforce what we were talking about just before the president came out, to see how he was going to respond, it became clear from that speech that when he looked at his possible options, military or a larger diplomatic or government administration response, so far they're choosing administration response with sanctions, Lester.
Courtney Kuby at the Pentagon, thank you. Casey Hunt is on Capitol Hill. Casey, we know Democrats have been saying we need more information about what led up to all this. Were any of those questions answered today, and what are you hearing up there?
The big question that was answered here, Lester, seems to be that the president is taking a relatively de-escalatory path, and some of his top allies already out on Twitter, Congressman Mark Meadows, saying that this was a forceful address that shows that this president is being, on the one hand, strong, on the other hand, avoiding an armed conflict, trying to keep America out of a broader war. So certainly it seems as though Republicans are prepared to back him in that way. We are still waiting to hear from the top Democrats here in Congress about whether they consider this to be a de-escalation. And I do think you're still going to see a lot of questions from lawmakers about exactly where we stand in this back and forth with Iran. As Brett McGurk was alluding to, that still seems to be going on. So does Congress need to potentially act to pass something trying to limit the president's powers? The House may go down that road. Of course, Republicans control the Senate. So from that perspective, that might be unlikely. Lester.
All right, Casey, thank you. Let's go to Chuck Todd, moderator of Meet the Press and our political director. Chuck, did the president find an off-ramp here? Did the Iranians in this attack in some way give him an off-ramp?
They did, and he took it. But he didn't want to look like he took it. And I think that's why you heard him, I think, try to use forceful language in announcing the sanctions, use forceful language in not saying they're not going to retaliate for this. But it's pretty clear our retaliation for now appears to be the sanctions. I think it is notable at how ham-handedly the president tried to politicize this by blaming the previous administration for financing. We're glossing over that. The sitting president of the United States accusing essentially the previous president of helping to finance Iranian weapons is quite remarkable that he's willing to push the envelope like that with this office. I mean, I guess at this point we shouldn't be surprised that he does these things anymore. It's still a remarkable thing that he actually did it. For me, there was one giant notable omission in his remarks, and it was the lack of outreach or olive branch to the Iraqi government, who basically wants to kick the Americans out. And strategically, that would obviously be potentially a disaster when you think about ISIS. The lack of any sort of olive branch to Iraq, I think, was notable and perhaps a diplomatic mistake.
And what about this reaching out to NATO, an organization that he's broadly criticized now, asking them to become more involved in the Middle East? How do you think that's going to fly?
Well, we'll see. I mean, our European allies in this have been skeptical of what we've been doing as it is with Iran. Obviously, this would be a way of almost sort of forcing there to look like there's an international coalition. I get what the president is trying to do here. Right now, it looks like America's alone in this with the Gulf states, and that's it when it comes to confronting Iran. Bringing NATO in, I think, gives the appearance of an international coalition.
All right, Chuck Todd, thank you very much. And so what appears to be a step back by the president this morning from a cycle of escalation and what many feared was the brink of war between the United States and Iran. But this story is far from over, of course. Breaths are still held largely. We will continue to follow all developments. I'll be back with a full wrap-up when I see you this evening on NBC Nightly News. For all of us at NBC News, I'm Lester Holt in New York. Good day.